I used to think love could fix anything. Maybe it's because every movie, every song, every dream I grew up with told me that if you just love someone enough, the rest will fall into place. When I met Michael, that idea felt true. He wasn't the kind of man who overwhelmed a room, but he had this quiet confidence, this sort of calm that made you want to stand closer. I met him at a friend's birthday party on a rainy Saturday night in downtown Chicago. I remember he was wearing a dark sweater, his sleeves rolled up, and he looked comfortable in his skin. We started talking about the music that was playing, and before I knew it, the conversation had drifted from playlists to childhood dreams and favorite coffee spots. There was nothing extraordinary about it, but that's what made it special. Everything with him felt natural, like I didn't have to pretend or perform. The first few months were everything I thought love was supposed to be. We stayed up late talking about everything and nothing, walking through the city, laughing at the smallest things. He used to text me good morning before his first coffee, and I would send him a photo of my breakfast like some silly teenager. I was 27, working as a graphic designer, living alone in a small apartment near the river. My life felt steady, but when he entered it, suddenly it had color. He made me feel chosen, not just loved. When he proposed, it wasn't some grand gesture. We were sitting on the couch one Sunday, surrounded by half-eaten pizza and a movie we weren't even watching. He looked at me, smiled that quiet smile, and said, "I don't ever want to imagine my life without you." Then he pulled out a small box, and I started laughing through tears. It was clumsy and honest and perfectly us. We married 6 months later in a small garden behind an old library, with fairy lights hanging above and my favorite song playing softly. I remember thinking, this is what happiness feels like. Everyone said we looked radiant, like a couple who truly found each other. The first few weeks after the wedding felt like living inside a promise. We decorated our apartment together, arguing playfully about where to hang the pictures, whose coffee mugs to keep, what color the curtains should be. He'd come home tired but smiling, kiss me on the forehead, and ask about my day. I'd tell him about work, about the weird clients or funny moments, and he'd listen. Or at least I thought he did. There was comfort in routine, warmth in the small things, and I told myself this was what real love looked like. Quiet, stable, grown-up. But even then, small cracks were forming, hairline fractures that I didn't want to see. It started with the silences, not the comfortable kind, but the heavy ones that sat between us during dinner. He would scroll through his phone while I tried to fill the air with conversation. "You're quiet tonight," I'd say softly. "Just tired," he'd answer without looking up. I told myself it was normal, that everyone settles after the rush of the honeymoon phase. But some nights I would lie awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange kind of loneliness that didn't make sense. I was married, loved, safe, so why did I feel so far away? He began working late more often. The first few times I didn't think much of it. Deadlines, big project. I believed him because I wanted to. I cooked dinner for 2, waited, then wrapped his plate in foil when he didn't come. When he finally arrived, his smile felt different, polite, practiced. "I'm sorry, babe. You know how it is." I nodded, but something inside me whispered that I didn't know anymore. Our weekends turned quieter too. We used to wander through flea markets, laugh at random things, take spontaneous road trips. Now, Saturday mornings were spent with him reading news on his phone while I drank coffee in silence. Sometimes I'd glance at him and wonder if he noticed me at all. Once I asked, "Do you ever miss how it used to be?" He looked confused, like he didn't understand the question. "We're just comfortable now." "That's a good thing." I nodded again, but the word comfortable felt like a blanket that was slowly suffocating me. There were moments when I caught myself searching his face for the man I fell in love with, the one who made me laugh until I cried, who couldn't stop touching my hand in the car, who asked me questions just to hear me talk. He was still there somewhere. I'd see glimpses of him when he'd surprise me with flowers or hold my hand at family dinners. But the spark that once lit everything between us now flickered weakly, barely visible beneath the weight of routine. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I'd sit at my desk with a cup of tea and just pour everything out. Not about him directly, but about the way love changes, how it can feel both infinite and invisible. Sometimes he'd walk by, glance at me, and smile softly. "You and your thoughts," he'd say. I'd smile back. But I wondered if he ever noticed that most of my words were about how lost I felt beside him. One evening, we were invited to a friend's party, one of those gatherings where everyone pretends they're doing great. I put on a dress he used to love and asked if it looked okay. He glanced up briefly, nodded, and said, "Yeah, you look nice." Nice. Not beautiful, not stunning, just nice. At the party, he spent the most of the night talking to his colleagues, while I stood near the snack table, making small talk with people I barely knew. At some point, I looked across the room and saw him laughing. His face lit up in a way that I hadn't seen in months. It hit me like a wave, the realization that maybe he just wasn't that person with me anymore. When we got home that night, I asked, "Are you happy?" The words came out quieter than I intended. He looked at me, puzzled. "What kind of question is that?" I shrugged, pretending it was nothing, but inside, something cracked open. I wanted him to say yes, to pull me close and reassure me that we were okay. Instead, he sighed, said he was tired, and went to bed. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the city lights through the window, wondering how two people who once shared everything could now feel like strangers in the same home. Maybe I should have said more that night. Maybe I should have asked him what changed, or if he even noticed. But I didn't. I was afraid of the answer, afraid he'd tell me something I already knew deep down. So I stayed quiet, convincing myself that all marriages go through dull phases, that love matures, and that I was just being dramatic. But sometimes silence is not peace. It's distance dressed as calm. The next morning, I woke up early and watched him sleep. His face was peaceful, almost boyish. And for a moment, I felt a rush of tenderness. I remembered why I married him, how certain I'd been that he was my forever. But that certainty had turned into something else. Not regret, but confusion. How could love that once felt so alive become something I barely recognized? How could I be lying beside the man I loved and still feel utterly alone? And that's where everything began to shift, though I didn't know it yet. I had built my world around the idea of us. But slowly, I was realizing that maybe love isn't always enough. Maybe sometimes it fades quietly, not with betrayal or cruelty, but with the simple passing of days. It started so gradually, I almost didn't notice. Days melted into weeks, and the rhythm of our lives became predictable, like a song that had lost its melody but kept the beat. He'd wake before sunrise, drink his coffee standing by the sink, check his phone, kiss my cheek, and leave. I'd stay in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, listening to the echo of his footsteps in the hallway, telling myself that this was normal, that marriage was supposed to settle into something quiet. But the quiet grew heavy. It wasn't the kind that feels like peace. It was the kind that hums in your ears, reminding you that something is missing. I started filling my evenings with work, staying later at the office just so I wouldn't have to face the stillness at home. My coworkers began inviting me out more often, and I said yes even when I didn't feel like it. Sitting in noisy bars with the smell of beer and cheap perfume in the air, I'd laugh at their stories, pretending to belong, while my mind replayed small moments between Michael and me, like the way he used to wait for me outside my building with coffee, or how he'd rest his hand on my knee when we watched movies. Now I couldn't even remember the last time he reached for me without thinking about it. When I did come home early, he was often already asleep on the couch, TV still glowing blue against his face. Sometimes I'd stand there watching him, trying to feel something familiar, but instead I felt like I was looking at a memory that hadn't realized it had ended. I'd turn off the TV, cover him with a blanket, and walk quietly to our bedroom. Those small, caretaking gestures used to make me feel close to him. Now they felt like I was caring for a stranger who had once been my home. We argued more often, though even our fights felt muted. Nothing explosive, just sharp little exchanges that cut in all the wrong places. One night I asked if he could spend less time on his phone during dinner, and he said, without even looking up, "You always find something to complain about." I remember freezing, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like kindness had become optional. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I just miss talking to you," I said. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said, "You always overthink everything. We're fine." But I knew we weren't. At work, my manager noticed the difference before I did. "You look tired," she said one morning, as I was trying to focus on a design layout. "Everything okay at home?" I smiled, told her I was fine, but inside, a voice whispered that maybe I wasn't. That evening, I found myself sitting on the train longer than I needed to, watching strangers scroll through their phones, laugh quietly, hold hands. I felt invisible, like I was drifting through my own life as a background character. Then came the small betrayals, the ones that don't make headlines but still leave scars. Missed calls, vague explanations, half smiles that didn't reach his eyes. One night, he said he had to go to a work retreat out of town. He packed fast, kissed my forehead, and promised to call when he arrived. The call never came. When I finally reached him the next day, his tone was distant. "Sorry, things got busy." I wanted to believe him, but his pauses were longer, his laughter forced. That night, I sat on our bed with the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the empty space beside me. I realized I no longer recognized the sound of his voice when he wasn't pretending. After that, I stopped asking questions I didn't want the answers to. We became polite roommates, sharing the same space but living separate lives. He'd come home late, I'd pretend to be asleep. He'd text from the other room instead of walking over to talk. I kept trying to fix small things, cooking his favorite meals, suggesting weekend plans, dressing up for no reason, but each effort felt like throwing petals into the wind. Pretty, but useless. My friends began to notice too. During brunch one Sunday, my best friend Clara asked, "Are you happy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I tried to laugh it off, said something about how marriage has ups and downs, but she just looked at me, her eyes soft with concern. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said quietly. I felt my throat tighten, and for a moment I almost told her everything. But then I shook my head and said, "It's fine. Really." Because how do you explain to someone that your heart is breaking for no dramatic reason, just slowly, quietly, every day? At night, I began scrolling through old photos of us, vacations, birthdays, that first Christmas together. In every picture, we looked so alive. I tried to remember what it felt like to be that girl in those images, the one who believed love could carry her through anything. But memories are tricky. They soften the edges, make you nostalgic for something that might not have been as perfect as you remember. Still, I clung to them because they were the only proof that we had once been real. The turning point came on a rainy Friday evening. I came home early, planning to surprise him with dinner. The apartment smelled faintly of his cologne, but he wasn't there. His laptop was open on the table, a half-finished glass of whiskey beside it. I noticed a message notification pop up, a name I didn't recognize. My heart skipped, but before I could stop myself, I looked. It wasn't a scandalous message, just a simple, "Wish you could have stayed longer today." Still, it said everything. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop. When he walked in an hour later, smiling faintly, I asked how work was. "Long," he said, loosening his tie. "You?" I just nodded, pretending nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain tapping against the window, my mind replaying that single message over and over.
Maybe it was harmless, maybe not. But what hurt wasn't the possibility of betrayal, it was the certainty of distance. The fact that someone else had become the place where he laughed easily again, where his attention felt effortless. And I realized that somewhere along the line, I had stopped being that place. I didn't confront him right away. Maybe I should have. But I needed to understand what I was feeling before turning it into another fight. Instead, I started watching him more closely. The way he avoided eye contact when I asked about his day, the way he smiled at texts he didn't explain. Every detail became a clue, and every clue confirmed what I already knew. We were slipping away from each other, and neither of us knew how to hold on. Still, part of me kept hoping that maybe if I said the right thing or planned the right evening, we could find our way back. But love, I was learning, isn't a puzzle you can solve with enough effort. Sometimes it just unravels quietly while you're too busy trying to fix what's already gone.
The night it all finally broke didn't begin with shouting or some grand betrayal. It started with silence, the kind that fills every corner of the room until it feels heavy enough to crush you. He came home later than usual, his jacket damp from the drizzle outside, his expression unreadable. I was sitting at the kitchen table, dinner untouched, the candles I'd lit hours earlier burned down to small pools of wax. I remember watching him take off his shoes slowly, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. "Hey," he said, his voice low, distracted. I answered softly, "Hey." There was a pause so long it felt like an entire conversation we weren't brave enough to have. I gestured to the food. "I made lasagna, your favorite." He nodded, glanced at the table, and said, "I already ate." My hands froze on the edge of the plate. It was such a small sentence, but it landed like a confession. Something inside me finally cracked open. I looked at him, not at the man I'd married, but at the stranger standing in my kitchen. "Where were you?" I asked quietly. He looked away, jaw tightening. "I told you, work." I laughed, a sound that didn't feel like mine. "You said that yesterday and the day before. Michael, just tell me the truth." He dropped his keys on the counter, ran a hand through his hair, and sighed. "Why do you always have to make things complicated? I'm tired, okay? I can't do this right now." "Do what?" I said, my voice trembling. "Talk to your wife?" He looked at me then, really looked, and for a second I thought he might say something to save us. Instead, he whispered, "Maybe this isn't working anymore." The room spun a little, and I had to grab the back of the chair to steady myself. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. He shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. We've been unhappy for a long time, haven't we? I keep trying to feel what I used to feel, but it's not there. Maybe it's better if we take some space." The words hung between us like smoke. I stared at him, my mind racing through every memory, every promise. Every night I'd stayed up hoping he'd come home smiling again. "Take some space?" I repeated, almost laughing. "We live together, we build a life together, and you want space?" He looked down, his voice barely audible. "I think I already took it." That was when I noticed his small suitcase near the door. My heart stopped. He'd packed while I was still trying to hold us together. "You're leaving," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. He just said, "I need time to think." I wanted to scream, to beg, to remind him of the promises we'd made, the love we swore would never fade. But all that came out was a whisper. "Think about what?" He hesitated, eyes filled with something like regret. He said, "Maybe if I still belong here." That sentence shattered something deep inside me. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, numb, watching the man I thought was my forever gather his things like he was leaving a hotel room instead of a marriage. He kissed me on the forehead before walking out, a gesture so familiar it hurt more than anything he could have said. The door closed softly, and that softness was unbearable.
The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, and suddenly the apartment was too quiet. I sat on the floor, still wearing the apron I'd put on hours earlier, surrounded by untouched food and candle wax and the echo of his absence. When the tears finally came, they didn't stop. I cried for the version of us that had died long before that night, for the girl who believed love was enough, for the silence that warned me but I refused to hear. Hours passed. I remember walking through the apartment, touching the things he left behind, a book, a sweater, his mug on the counter. Every object felt like a ghost. I opened the window, even though it was cold, needing air, needing proof that the world outside was still moving while mine had stopped. Around dawn, I saw his toothbrush still by the sink. I thought about throwing it away, but I couldn't. Instead, I just stared at it, realizing that maybe some things don't end with a goodbye. They just stop being shared. I called him once that morning, straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What could I say? That I didn't know how to breathe without the sound of his keys at the door? That the silence felt like punishment? That I wasn't angry, just hollow? None of it would have mattered. For days, I lived in limbo. Every sound in the hallway made me think he might come back. Every buzz of my phone made my heart race. But he didn't call. He didn't text. The man who used to tell me I was his home had simply vanished into the city that once brought us together. I started noticing how time stretches when you're waiting for someone who's not coming back. Mornings became endless. Nights became unbearable. I would replay our last conversation in my head, trying to find the moment where I could have said something different, something that might have changed everything. But no matter how many times I rewrote it, he still walked away. One evening, I caught my reflection in the window and almost didn't recognize myself. There was no anger in my eyes, just exhaustion. I whispered to the empty room, "Where did we go wrong?" The silence didn't answer. It just sat there, patient, waiting for me to accept what I already knew. Sometimes love ends quietly, like a candle that burns itself out.
The first morning without him, I woke up too early. The bed felt too big, too quiet, too honest. The sunlight crept in through the curtains, landing on his side of the bed, and for a second I almost reached out, expecting warmth. But there was only the cold imprint of absence. The apartment smelled like dust and yesterday's coffee. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor, felt like it was reminding me he wasn't here anymore. I tried to keep myself busy at first. I cleaned the kitchen, folded the laundry, watered the plants, little rituals that made me feel like life was still happening. But grief has this strange way of showing up in the middle of ordinary things. You open a drawer and find his favorite pen. You walk past a bakery and smell his favorite bread. Every reminder feels like a small betrayal of progress. I started avoiding places we used to go. The coffee shop on Clark Street, the bookstore where we spent rainy Sundays. Even the park near our building felt like a minefield of memories. Friends tried to help. They took me out for drinks, filled the air with laughter that didn't quite reach me. I smiled when they joked, nodded when they said time heals everything. But when I got home, the silence was waiting, like an old friend who never left. One night, Clara stayed over, afraid to leave me alone. We drank tea and talked until the candles melted away. She asked gently, "Do you think he's coming back?" I didn't answer, because hope, by then, felt like a dangerous thing, too heavy to hold, too painful to drop. Work became my refuge. Deadlines, projects, clients, they gave me structure, something to control when everything else had slipped through my fingers. But even there, I caught myself zoning out, staring at my screen, lost in the loop of what-ifs. What if I'd been more patient? What if I'd asked him sooner what he was feeling? What if love, in the end, just wasn't enough? There are no answers to those kinds of questions, only echoes. A few weeks later, I saw him by accident.
It was late afternoon, and I was walking home with groceries when I spotted him across the street. He looked almost the same coat, same calm way of moving, but there was something lighter about him, like he'd finally set something down. He was with someone, a woman I didn't recognize, and they were laughing. It wasn't a cruel sight, just real. I stood there for a moment, frozen between heartbreak and relief. Then I turned away before he could see me. I didn't want him to feel guilty. I didn't want to beg for something already gone. That night, I went home and cried for the last time. Not the messy, desperate kind of crying I'd done before, but the quiet, exhausted kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've reached the end of something and there's nothing left to hold on to but yourself. I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the city lights blur into the rain. For the first time, I didn't imagine him walking back through the door. I didn't check my phone for messages. I just let the emptiness sit beside me. It wasn't comforting, but it was honest. Over the next few months, life didn't magically get better, but it became bearable. I learned small things about myself I'd forgotten. How I like my coffee when I don't make it for two. How quiet can actually feel peaceful when it isn't filled with waiting. I started taking long walks again, rediscovering parts of the city that belonged to me before they belonged to us. Slowly, the memories stopped feeling like wounds and started feeling like chapters in a story I had survived. Sometimes I still catch myself wondering where he is, if he ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets leaving. But then I remember how it felt that night, the weight of his words, the way the door clicked shut. And I know that even if he did come back, it wouldn't be the same. The love we had was real, but real doesn't always mean forever. Now, when I tell this story, people always ask the same thing. If you could go back, would you still marry him? And the truth is, I would. Because even though it ended in silence, it taught me something louder than any promise ever could. It taught me that love isn't just about finding someone who chooses you, it's also about learning to choose yourself when they don't. I still wear the ring sometimes, not as a symbol of what I lost, but of what I learned. That I can survive heartbreak, that I can rebuild, that I can wake up alone and still feel whole, even when the bed feels too big and the mornings too quiet. And maybe that's the strange beauty of it all. Some people come into your life to stay, and some just teach you how to stand on your own. So tell me, have you ever loved someone so deeply that even when they left, a part of you stayed with them anyway?